Scopus theory by Hans Vermeer. What is scopus? To start with, this is a Greek word borrowed by Dr. Vermeer, which in his theory means purpose, as this quote from Christiane Nord explains. And I quote, Greek for purpose is the prime principle and determining any translation process, and the purpose, scopus, refers to the overall purpose of the translational action. So when we refer to scopus, we're talking about the purpose, the aim or function that the target text must fulfill amongst its readers. Is the expected use that readers are going to make of our translation. And this is the scopus rule suggested by Vermeer to accompany the actual concept. A translatum, Latin word, Latin term that he used for our common parlance, we use translation, but he used translatum to refer to an offer of information in a language 2 based on an offer for information, textual offer for information in a language 1, is a function of its scopus. And therefore the scopus rule would be spelled out this way. Each text is produced for a given purpose and should serve this purpose. So that's the summarized version of the scopus rule. The amplified version or expansive version of the rule would be formulated by Vermeer as follows. You should translate, you should interpret, you should speak, you should write in a way that enables your text, your translation, your interpretation, your speech, your written text to function in the situation in which it is used and with the people who want to use it, and precisely in the way they want it to function. It's a quote from Vermeer, 1989. So this is the overall scopus rule. This has several interesting implications for translation, especially when we place translation functionalism in the timeline of translation theory. As you can see, first of all, the overall dominant norm or point of reference for a translator in order to create a certain translation and choose a certain create a certain translation, let's say, or produce a certain text, would be the purpose, the intended purpose of this translation amongst its readers. And that's the way we should translate. As you can see, this is really prescriptive in the sense that we should translate, we should speak, we should interpret, so as to allow the text, our translation, to function properly as expected in a certain situation, target environment situation, and with the target readers, the people who are going to be using it. And it has to be precisely the way they want it to function. So as you can see, we turn our eyes towards the receiving end, towards the target culture or the target language environment, to the target readership. And the most important, in this case, value would be for us to choose a purpose or to have a purpose assigned to our translation. And our translation and our methodology and our decisions during the translation process should serve this function to the letter or as precisely as possible. There was a misunderstanding, although if one reads the work of Hans Vermeer, it was I would say that as a side note that it wasn't really that big of a misunderstanding. But the idea is that the scopus rule does not dictate how that translation should be free, does not dictate the methodology, does not dictate the strategy. Some people have interpreted the Hans Vermeer's scopus rule as an anarchy in translation. The idea that we can translate, that we should translate freely and detach the translation radically from the source text. Christiane Nord would defend Hans Vermeer's work later on and try to clarify that this is not the case. That translation, that scopus, when we have a scopus, scopus really helps us to situate the translation in the somewhere between the two extremes of literal or free translation, the traditional opposing poles or methodologies or strategies of translation, literal or free. And depending on the purpose or the scopus that we have been assigned for our translation, we will choose a certain methodology somewhere in between literal or free. In other words, we would translate in a way that fulfills the scopus. And if this requires a literal translation, we will do a literal translation, or we will go for that, or we will adopt that strategy. If, on the other hand, the purpose of the functional translation calls for a freer translation, then we would choose that, we would go down that road. But as such, especially according to Nord, the scopus theory does not prescribe, does not enact how or require the translator how to translate or what the proper methodology or strategy is. We would just choose accordingly so that we can fulfill the scopus, whatever this is. Although this phrase, the dethroning of the source text, is rather telling from the point of view of Hans Vermeer, because it establishes that users are the target readers of the translator, and the target environment and the purpose of the target text is what counts for translators. It's what matters. He actually said that in this case, the dethroning of the source text, that the scopus theory means a dethroning of the source text. For certain theorists, the original was to reign supreme, and in this case, Hans Vermeer himself referred to his theory of scopus theory as a dethroning of the source text. So to a certain degree, it's not surprising that some individuals who were attached to loyalty to the source text and to authors, especially to authoritative texts, the names of scholars like Peter Newmark, for instance, come to mind, would decry this scopus theory as a call to anarchy, or a call to destroy the source text, or to go against it in translation. Christian and Nord will try to tone down this idea later on. So, as we say, the key factor for translations and for translators and the translation process in scopus theory is the target text, the needs of the receiver, the needs of the addressee or target readers, and the intended use that the translation is going to have. Because we have a source text that was originally written, say for instance, Don Quixote was written originally in Spanish, although there are some interesting individuals who think that it was originally written in a different language and not written in Spain at all. But those are conspiracy theories that we won't go into right now. But say that we have the Don Quixote written in Spanish originally for a target audience, which might be Spanish readers. What occurs in this case that we have a text or author of information or translatum, in Vermeer's words, and then when it comes to translating, if this text, which may have been produced without any thought given to an eventual or potential translation of this text, we need to imagine that we are entrusted with the mission of creating a Quixote in English or German. This target text would be, according to Nord, and I quote, an offer of information formulated by a translator in a target language and a culture, target culture, about an offer of information formulated by someone else in a source culture and for source readers. So Cervantes wrote the Quixote in Spanish for Spanish-speaking readers in a certain environment, in a certain cultural environment or cultural setting, and the translation is a new text about the Quixote, written in the target language for a new set of readers in a new environment. So as we see, in this case, we need to focus, we follow what the functionalists are defending in this case, or advocating, the translator needs to look in the direction of the target readers, not so much, or at all, in the direction of the original Spanish readers in the original environment. We have a new communication setting, and the translator needs to serve needs to serve the goals of fulfilling the scopus or meeting the requirements, expectations of the reader. So we have in this case these two main components of coherence and fidelity. Fidelity has been, and loyalty has been discussed for centuries when it comes to translation. So when we talk about the scopus, this will be the governing rule for Vermeer and his followers and functionalism in general. We look at the scopus, and without a scopus we cannot translate. Fidelity has to do with the relationship between the target text and the source text. It's not so much an interpersonal situation. When translating the Quixote into Spanish, we're not being loyal to Miguel de Cervantes. In either case, we are looking at is mainly an interpersonal. The contrary is not. We cannot be loyal, as Cristiano will say. We cannot be loyal to a text. We have to be loyal to an individual. So when we talk about fidelity, we're talking about the relationship system between a target text and the source text. And finally, at the base of the pyramid, we have the intertextual coherence. The target text is understandable and meaningful to receivers. It must have some degree of coherence in this case. So we are to be connected to the source text, but just enough to provide that coherence, that intertextual coherence that must be appreciated or found in the target text. So as you can see, we wouldn't translate. We have two examples here, proposed by Cristiano Nor herself. I'm taking those from her, adapting those from her. A client may need a literal translation of a driver's license or a birth certificate for what? For administrative purposes. So in this case, we need those translations, as you can see, what you can imagine, to act as official documents. So the scopus of the translation is to produce a text, a translation, in this case of a birth certificate or a driver's license, to produce a target text that works, that functions as an original document and is received and used as such in the target context. Therefore, we need to choose a strategy that would allow us to fulfill this scopus. It might likely be a more literal or closed, or a text that we will produce a text that is close formally and in terms of meaning to the original documents, because we need accuracy. The documents need to be a faithful rendition or picture of the original. Look at the example 2. A publishing house wants to launch a modern-day language version of a classic such as the Odyssey for modern readers. But these readers are high school age readers. So what needs do these high school age readers have? The scopus perhaps calls for almost an adaptation of the source text in certain passages. We change the language register. We make the original work accessible in its translated form. So as you can see, different scopus or scopoi, different scopus call, or different intended functions would call for different translation strategies. In the next part of the discussion, we will look at the Cristiano Nor's model for translation-oriented source text analysis, its rationale, and the main elements or components of the model.